question is, at the top of page 100, we have the line Mashiv Haruach Umorid Hageshem. Hashem is Mashiv Haruach. He causes the wind to blow, Umorid Hageshem, and causes the rain to come down. We mentioned in last week's class that this line is said during the winter months of the year, during the rainy season in Israel. And when it's not the rainy season, particularly between Pesach and Shemoneh Esreh, we either have the custom to leave this line out entirely, that's the custom of Ashkenazim outside of Israel, or the custom of Sephardim world over, and Ashkenazim in Israel, and Hasidim, is to replace this line during the summer months with the phrase Morid Hatal, which means he causes the dew to come down. Did you have a further question about it?
I just wondered why it's not the same.
Why is the custom not the same between all communities?
Why isn't it as dominant here? If Mashiv Haruach and Morid HaGashem is, we say it, why don't we all just say Morid Hatal?
Why don't we all say Morid Hatal? So this is a great question. I can just answer very, very transparently that I've never researched the origin of this divergent custom. I just know what it is. But I'm fascinated by it, and I want to look it up, and I want to get back to you. So let me make a comment because it's relevant. Something we said last week, but I'll repeat it now because you're here and you didn't hear it. And that is this paragraph, one of the major themes of this paragraph is the resurrection of the dead. It starts with that, Ata Gibor La'olam Hashem, you are mighty forever Hashem, Mechayei Meisim Ata, you bring the dead to life. Okay? And it's repeated a bunch of times. Right after the line we just said, the falling of the rains, we say, Mechalkel Chayim Bechesed, you provide life with kindness. Mechayei Meisim, you give life to the dead. Birachamim Rabim, with great mercy. So there it is again. And in the next line, at the end of the line, it says, Kayem Emunaso Lishenei Afar, you fulfill your emunah, your faithfulness, your loyalty to those who are resting in the earth. And then at the end of the next line, it says, Melech Memis Chayeh, king who causes death and brings to life. And then the next line, V'ne'eman ata lahachayos meisim, you are faithful to give life to the dead. And then blessed are you Hashem, mechayeh hameisim, the one who gives life to the dead. So this whole paragraph is very, very much focused on the idea of giving life to the dead. And I mentioned last week that we asked the question that why are these things grouped together? You have rain and you have resurrection. Why are these things together? So that was last week's topic. Go to last week's recording. I sent it out in an email today and you'll see more. But here's the point I want to immediately address to you is one of the reasons we said is because the concept of the resurrection is linked textually to the falling of the dew. The gist of it is that that Yeshayahu is calling those who lie in the earth, the Yeshenei Afar, those who are lying in the earth, he calls on them to rise up with the falling of the dew. He says, the Tal Oros, the dew of light has fallen upon you, so therefore arise. And it's called Tal Oros, the dew of light, which we said, according to Rashi, is it's the light is a metaphor for the light of Torah, and this dew is linked to Torah and righteous deeds. That because of the Torah and righteous deeds that these people performed in their lifetime, it's sort of going to call them out of the grave at the time of the resurrection. So the language of the prophet is a language of dew, Tal. And so because Tal and resurrection are linked by the Navi, so we have them also linked in the Tefillah. But it was for that reason that I was even more fascinated by this same question that you asked, was troubling me, is that if the dew is such a strong link to the resurrection that it's actually stated by the Navi that way, then why did the... So then I totally understand why there's Morid Hatal in this bracha, why it says the dew falls. Why is that here? Because we're talking about resurrection, so let's talk about the dew, because the prophet did that. The Navi did that. So how did it arise that in some communities they leave it out? They don't say it. Our custom is not to say it, Ashkenazim, here in the diaspora. So what's that? Well, what's your custom? A lot of people say it, but it depends on your custom, right? The Ashkenazi custom, that's a Nusach Sfard, right? Not Nusach Ashkenaz. The Ashkenaz was not, it's not in the art scroll, okay? The art scroll Ashkenaz Siddur. So why do we leave it out? I don't know. I'm very curious about that, because it seems to be very intentionally it should be in there.
How strong is the custom?
Well, how strong is which of not to say it?
Like, should you not say it if it's not the custom?
This is a good question. This is a question for a halachic expert in this area, which is not. So I don't know. Could you say it if you want to? If it's not your custom and you feel like saying it, could you just do it? You'd ask someone like Rabbi David. Okay. So let's look at the next line where it says Mechalkel Chayim B'Chesed. He provides life with kindness. So last week we had Cliff here who said that this line of Mechalkel Chayim B'Chesed, he provides life with kindness, follows naturally from the previous line of he brings the winds and he brings the rain. These are the natural forces which allow for life to thrive on earth. So it follows along nicely. The question that we didn't ask last week was, it's interesting that it says Mechalkel Chayim B'Chesed. He provides life with kindness. The second bracha, this whole second bracha, is really more a reflection of the attribute of judgment. The first bracha number 1, which is more strongly linked to Avraham, is the bracha of kindness, which is the attribute of Avraham. The second bracha is linked to Yitzchak, which is another reason why it has to do with the resurrection, because Yitzchak, we know that Avraham brought Yitzchak up on the altar on Mount Moriah as a sacrifice. He was stopped from slaughtering him, but according to some of the midrashic literature, Yitzchak's soul nevertheless departed at that moment that he was about to be slaughtered, and his soul was returned to him. So he died and he came back to life. So Yitzchak is also connected with Mechayeh HaMisim, with the resurrection of the dead, and that's where the second bracha is the second one of the fathers, and that's Yitzchak, who's more closely related to the attribute of strict justice. So what's funny is that in the paragraph revolving around strict justice, we have God provides life with kindness. Kindness, what are you doing over here? Your show is over. Now we should be talking about judgment. And the next few words, Mechaye Mesim, he gives life to the dead, Birachamim Rabim, with abundant mercy. Rachamim, mercy, is a separate attribute from din, almost the opposite attribute. You'll remember the famous saying, and this is, I think Rashi says it. There's a famous saying among the sages that if you look at the creation story in the first chapter of the Torah, everything is with the name of Hashem Elokim, which is the name that represents the attribute of justice. And then only in the second chapter, we find Hashem Elokim, the two names together, the name of mercy together with the name of judgment. So our sages say that initially God wanted to create the world with pure justice, and he saw that this attribute would not be able to maintain itself because human beings couldn't stand up to such an exacting attribute if the world was purely existing in that realm of strict justice. And therefore, he combined the attribute of mercy into the world. And so that's why we find in the sort of the replay of the creation story, there's Hashem Elohim, both names together. So there's what's called Midas Hadin, the attribute of justice, together with Midas Harachamim, the attribute of mercy. So these are almost opposing forces. And yet we find in this bracha, Chesed and Rachamim. So it's a little bit funny. One other thing I want to say, just because I'm remembering it, is the other connection between the resurrection and judgment is that in Sefer Daniel, it says that everyone will stand up for resurrection, and they'll be judged at that time. Everyone's going to stand up. It's a question how to understand the verse in Daniel. It's not so clear if everyone's going to stand up in the resurrection or only the righteous are going to stand up in the resurrection. That's usually the way we understand it, is the righteous are resurrected and the non-righteous are not resurrected. But there is a way to read it that everyone's resurrected for a judgment period, and then the wicked are punished and they go back in the ground, right? And the righteous remain for everlasting life. So someone once made a point in one of the classes, which I know because I watched the recording of it. I had to edit it, so I watched it a bunch of times. That someone made, it was you made this point. We were talking about the soul and the body. We're talking about body and soul, so class number 3. And you made the point that these two need each other. The body needs the soul, and the soul needs the body, because the body without a soul is inanimate, and the soul without a body can't do anything. So they need each other. So this resurrection reminds me, and again, I didn't look it up, so I don't know exactly where it is. There's a famous story about Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and Antoninus. Antoninus, the character called Antoninus that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi has a lot of interactions with. It's a question who he is, because there were 2 Roman Caesars whose name were Antoninus. It may have been more, but 2 famous ones, and they came one right after the other. One was someone called Antoninus Pius, Antoninus Pius, Pius, in Hebrew Antoninus Pius, and his adopted son was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. He was usually known as Marcus Aurelius. That's usually what they call him, but in Jewish literature he's called Antoninus, which was his given name, and Marcus Aurelius was his emperor, his Roman emperor name. Kind of like the popes take on a title, Pope Pius, Pope Benedict, whatever. They choose that name. But his name was Antoninus, and that's what our literature calls him. But in the secular literature, he's called Marcus Aurelius. Most likely the Antoninus that our literature speaks of is Marcus Aurelius. Very, very fascinating. So we're talking about the end of the 1st century CE, when it was the period when Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was essentially redacting the Mishnah. The Roman period in general is one of very, very great repression of the Jews and persecution. Terrible suffering under the Romans, and they viciously tried to rip us apart from Torah learning, Torah observance. And this caused a danger, an existential danger, that the Torah, particularly the oral Torah, would be forgotten, because the written Torah you could read, but oral Torah has to be taught from teacher to student. We didn't have a written version of it. We didn't have a Mishnah. We didn't have a Gemara. So it required a teacher-to-student relationship, and that was what the Romans were after. So the oral Torah was losing its grip on the Jewish people, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi saw the need to create a written version of it, which would ultimately become the Mishnah. This project was a tremendous, tremendous undertaking with the cooperation of many, if not all, of the sages of the time, to just collect all the information that everybody had and try to shrink it down into a very, very succinct volume that could be easily transmitted, memorized. That's why the Gemara can spend pages unraveling one line of Mishnah, because it's a ton of information packed into very few words, so it can be memorized and transmitted easily. It's almost written in like a code, and it has to be decoded, unraveled. It was a very, very big project, and the only reason that Rebbe was successful in doing it is because God arranged at that time for there to be a very benevolent Philo-Semitic emperor named Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. And and he became very good friends with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. These were very good. They had a very close friendship. Our traditional literature tells us that the relationship was kept secret because the Romans were so anti-Semitic that if they would think that their emperor was friends with the Jewish rabbi, they would have revolted against him. And I haven't found any secular records of this relationship. It seems to only be known by us, by design. And they were both great philosophers. So Marcus Aurelius has actually left us a book of philosophy you could buy at any normal bookstore. It's called Meditations. If you go into a bookstore, you can buy in the classics section, you can buy a book of philosophy called Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I've read it. It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. It reads like KOLLEL. You read it, you think you're reading KOLLEL. It's he was a Stoic, which basically means that he was sort of into the repression of worldly desires and emotionalism, and he was very into virtue. His whole thing was man is put into this world to refine his character and to achieve virtue. We're not here to chase pleasures. We're not here to chase food and drink and that sort of thing, and music and parties. We're here to develop our character and to develop our virtue. It's incredible. It's a really phenomenal book. And you can see why these two got along so well. Anyway, many of their philosophical discussions are recorded by our literature, and one of them, and I don't remember where it is basically like this. He says, Antonina says to Rabbi, he says, how can God punish a human being in the afterlife? How is it possible? He said, because the body, can he punish the body? The body is nothing if it's not animated by the soul. So the body can claim, don't punish me, it wasn't my fault, it was the soul that made me do it. Can you punish the soul? Because the soul could say, I didn't do anything, it was the body that committed all the acts. I'm just the soul, it's not possible for me to do anything. The body committed the act, I didn't do anything.
Blind man, a short guy, and you put one up.
So Rebbe says, let me tell you a parable to help you understand. He says there once was a rich fellow, and he had an orchard, and he wanted to hire a guard for his orchard. The problem was he didn't trust any of his guards, that if he would hire them to watch the orchard, they would steal from the orchard. So he had to find a guard who couldn't possibly steal. So he hired two fellows, one who was lame, could not walk, and one who was blind, if I'm saying it right. So basically, neither of them could possibly steal from the orchard because the blind guy didn't know where the stuff was, and the lame fellow wouldn't be able to reach it. So the king hires these two guards, and he lets them do their work. But they come up with a plan together. They say, look, the blind guy says, I can't see, but I can walk. The lame guy says, I can see, but I can't walk. So how about this? I'll go on your shoulders. The lame person says, I'll go on your shoulders. I'll tell you where to go, and you'll take me there, and I'll get all the fruit, and together we'll eat them, right? So at the end of the day, the king comes back, and he sees that the fruit is down from the trees, and there's, apple cores all over the ground, and these two fellows are laying there very satisfied. And he says, what's going on over here? You guys are supposed to guard my orchard, and you ate all my fruit. And the blind man says, me eat your fruit? I can't even see it. How could I possibly have gotten the fruit? And the lame guy says, me eat your fruit? I can't get up to walk over it. How could I have gotten the fruit? So what does the master do? He puts the lame fellow on the blind guy's shoulders, and he beats them both up like that. So that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says that the judgment day will be that God will bring the body and soul back together, and that'll be the judgment. Will be in combination. So to speak, after we go to the grave, according to this verse in Daniel, or one reading of the verse in Daniel, everyone's going to stand up for judgment. We'll all be, our body and soul come back for judgment, because that's the way we committed the crime. So that's the way that the judgment has to come, for better or for worse. It could also be, it doesn't have to be punishment, it could be reward, but So anyway, my point was that the resurrection is related to the concept of judgment. So that is not so out of place. And I didn't say any of this last week. I gave other connections, but this one I thought of in the interim. Yeah, this
So
is
we
fresh
have
information.
at least two judgments then. We have when we leave this world and we stand before Hashem and we're judged, and then we go to Gehenna for a little bit, or maybe not, and Hashem goes with you, that thing. So then that's one judgment. And then we have resurrection. So then there's another judgment.
Okay, you're
So
asking
how
a
many-
very good question. Then it seems like there's two judgments, because there is the judgment of the soul. Okay, so I don't know the answer to that, and it does seem to conflict. I will grant you that what I'm saying seems to conflict with what you're saying. That is, well, do we get judged in the afterlife in a spiritual way, or do we get judged sort of in a physical way, body and soul together? Because it shouldn't be both. It doesn't make sense. It should be both. Because based on what I just said, you can't judge the body alone, and you can't judge the soul alone.
No, and that's not I understand that. The question I have is, why are we then going to do it again?
Right. So you're assuming that we're doing it again. In other words, there's an assumption in your question that there's two stages. Meaning what you're saying is, I am aware that there's something called a judgment process that happens to the soul in the afterlife without the body. And now I'm adding to that new information that there seems to be a judgment with the body. That 1 + 1 = 2. There must be two judgments. Why should there be two judgments? Right? And in fact, what I said conflicts with the first judgment, because I'm saying, according to Antoninus' question, you can't judge the body without the soul. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi seems to agree with him and say, don't worry, we're going to get them back together for judgment. Sounds like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is saying the judgment is solely going to be body and soul together and not separate. And because didn't look into this more deeply, I just can't be more clear in the answer I'm going to give you, except there could be different views on how judgment takes place. And might have been Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's view that judgment takes place at the time of the resurrection. And that's how he was reading the verse in Daniel, because I mentioned there's two readings of it. That those who read it, that everyone gets up for resurrection, and then the righteous live on, and the wicked are kind of put back in the earth. And there are those who read the verse that everyone's going to be judged, but it's only the righteous who are going to rise. So I'm willing to entertain, without having looked further into it, that there are different views of how the judgment happens. It either happens before the resurrection and then only the righteous get up, or it happens at the resurrection and everyone gets up. And that would seem to conform to how Rebbe answered Antoninus. If Antoninus had asked this question to someone who holds that the judgment takes place prior to the resurrection, I don't know what their answer would have been. Because it seems, according to that view, and this seems to be the classic view, the more popular view is that only the righteous rise for the resurrection, and the punishment of the soul happens in the spiritual world in some way, and the body is disintegrated in the earth, and that's sort of that's the punishment of the body. It's cleansed of its iniquity in that way, and that's why there's a concept that the righteous don't decay in the grave because their bodies are perfect and don't need to undergo that process. And there are people who have dug up graves of righteous people who claim to have seen that their bodies were intact, which seems quite remarkable. If I'm not mistaken, I heard from Rabbi Beryl Wine himself that he was involved in moving bodies, in Eastern Europe when they were, they build like malls and highways and whatever over Jewish graves, that he went and got involved in moving the bodies to another spot, and he did disinter a well-known righteous individual, and he said that the body was fresh as the day he died, but it was we're not talking about a recent death. I don't remember who it was. I seem to recall hearing this from Rabbi Wine in person, so just don't remember the details. So the concept of the punishment of the body in the ground and the punishment of the soul, that's like the classic view. It is. But that notwithstanding, there is a connection between resurrection and judgment in the manner that I've described.
I was thinking that I heard that at that time there were Sadducees that had very differing opinions on the judgment.
The Sadducees didn't believe in the afterlife at all.
Yeah.
The Sadducees believed that the punishments and the rewards of the Torah were purely in this world, and they were essentially the fruits of one's actions. If you lived a righteous life, you would live a quality life, and that was its own reward. And if you lived a wicked life, you would lead bad things would happen to you, If you did all kinds of awful things, then it just makes it more likely that you're gonna fall into the pit that you dig for yourself. If you mess with people, they're gonna mess with you. If you're a robber, a thief, and a murderer, probably something bad's gonna happen to you in this world, just by natural consequences. Or sickness or that sort of thing. The Sadduceic view was not the classical Jewish view of the soul and an eternity and an afterlife. They didn't accept those concepts because they are not spoken of openly in the Torah. They are spoken of only in a hinted manner. And they were very hooked on the literal, straightforward reading of the text.
Karaites believe a lot of things that Sadducees do.
I cannot speak for what Karaites believe. I don't know. I'll tell you this. I once went to a Karaite website, and I wanted to read what they had to say. Okay? It claimed to be the official website of the Karaite movement. How much that's recognized, I don't know. I'm not going to tell you the name of the website. But the Karaites claimed that they're not a new movement like we say they rose this Karaite movement. Karaites, by the way, were, according to normal versions of history, they were a sect, a breakaway that happened in around the 9th or 10th century of Jews who basically rejected the oral tradition and only abided the written law, which sounds very similar to what the Sadducees were, 1,000 years earlier. And so they claimed that they are not a new sect. They're actually the continuation of the Sadduceic group. And of course, they're the authentic Judaism. And that's their claim. So in other words, they would say there's no difference between them and the Sadducees. It's exactly what they are. They said a lot of things on that website that I could spend the class arguing with because I don't agree on logical foundations with their claims. But that's not what this class is about. So,
Can you speak to the word mechalkel, because I think you translated it as
provides. Yeah, what does it say here?
It says
Sustains.
Sustains.
Okay.
So, is there any translation or commentary that says that that phrase means that the kindness that Hashem does is what sustains? It is, we are sustained because of Hashem's kindness, which is different than providing kindness to us.
We are sustained.
We're alive because Hashem wants us to be alive, because Hashem, in His kindness, allows us. It's like the Moda'ani,
Yes. So I will tell. I'm not. Here's how I'll respond to that, and you tell me if I misunderstood you. I don't think that what you're asking depends on how we translate the word mechalkel, whether it's sustains or provides, because I'm willing to enter. I'm using them synonymously. I don't mean for them to be so different. But when I wrote this in my notes, what I'm about to say to you, which I think is what you're saying now, that you could read this two ways. Mechalkel chayim bechesed. He sustains life or provides for life bechesed, with kindness. That the way that we go on is through God's kindness. He's providing for us and giving us sustenance, and that's an act of kindness on His part. And the chayim, we are the chayim. The chalkel chayim, those who are living, us, we are provided for by God through His attribute of kindness. And then there's another way to read it, which is mechalkel chayim. He provides life. He's providing the life itself. Not that He's providing for the needs of the living, but the life itself is being provided with kindness. So that's the way is He providing for life, or is He providing life? And I think it could be read either way. I think they're both simultaneously correct readings. In other words, both could be intended here.
Because the provision of life is more connected to the resuscitation of the dead.
Oh, excellent. Because if I'm providing life, the very life itself, the initial life, so then it sort of balances out. It follows that there's also the providing of life after death. There's the initial life. Okay. So Rav Schwab here identifies all three attributes of Hashem in the way that you've described. There's an initial spark of life, which is chesed. It's a gift, comes into the world from out of the world. It's not natural. Then there's death, which is part of the natural limitation of the world. That's the din. That's the judgment. That's the strict attribute of justice. And then there's the resurrection of the dead, which is the attribute of mercy. Mercy as opposed to kindness. Here's the difference between kindness and mercy. Kindness is on its own. It's an act of giving. Strict judgment, so to speak, is a non-giving. It's a withholding. That's a strict justice. It's a withholding. And mercy is a giving that overcomes the withholding. So mercy is always in relation to judgment. Even though both mercy and kindness are almost used synonymously because they're both acts of giving, but chesed is giving on its own in isolation, so to speak. Mercy is giving in response to a withholding, and with response to a din, to a judgment.
It's not in response to a request, of
Well, it depends. Yeah, okay, it depends. Because if I have to ask for it, that means until I asked for it, it was being withheld, right?
Okay.
So it's still overcoming what was before. The reality is now being overcome with mercy.
It's a response. It's an
So
outcome.
yeah, so here sort of the attribute of justice is sort of hiding between these two phrases. The giving, the initial giving, then there's a taking away, which leads way to the giving back. But the attribute of justice is sandwiched between these two statements. Next, somech nofilin. He supports those who fall. Hashem supports those who fall. Continuing. Virofei cholim, because the next few phrases really go together. Virofei cholim, and he heals the sick. Umatir asurim, and he releases, umatir, and he releases asurim, those who are bound. He releases those who are bound. Umkayem emunaso lishenei afar, and he upholds his faithfulness to those who rest in the dust. Okay. Rav Schwab says that what we see here is sort of a continuation of what we just said. There is a din, there's some type of limitation, and then there is the power of Hashem to overcome limitation. And if you were here last week, you'd know exactly where that comes from. The very first phrase in the bracha on the bottom of 98, Ata gibor le'olam Hashem, who said, you are mighty forever Hashem. That gibor, might, kivura, might, is the attribute of strict justice or restriction or withholding. And the word that follows it is le'olam. So le'olam means forever, which means like without limitation. So it's almost two conflicting words. Gibor le'olam. You sort of your gibor, your withholding, but forever, without limitation. What we explained, that was last week's class, we basically explained is the description here is that Hashem puts the limitations into place, but Hashem is not limited by those limitations. So the attribute of might is with the limitations he puts on us in our world that we inhabit, but his might, intrinsic to himself, so to speak, is beyond that limitation. And therefore, what we're seeing in this bracha is a statement of the limitations of the attribute of justice, the limitations of the world, and Hashem's power to overcome those limitations. I thought of something here that I think was appealing to me, that each one of these four stages, the supporting of the fallen, the healing of the sick, the releasing of the bound, and the raising of those in the dust, correspond to four stages in Jewish history. Now, what I'm saying is inspired by things that I read, but I didn't see anyone who says what I'm about to say. And how is that? Somech Noflim, he supports the fallen, is a reference to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and the taking of Jews into exile. Why? Because we have a paragraph called Ashrei. Well, it's really called Tehillah L'David, but Ashrei, right? And a good Jew is supposed to say it 3 times a day. And the Gemara says a person who says it 3 times a day is guaranteed a position in the world to come.
So they don't have to worry about anything else.
What's that?
So they can be terrible people.
Okay, that has to be understood in context, and I can't go into it now, but obviously with a limitation, right? Obviously. Because it also says, just to give you an example, it also says, V'chiper ad maso amo. That's a pasuk. V'chiper ad maso amo, which is interpreted to mean his land, ad maso, kiper, will provide atonement for amo, his nation. And the rabbis say from there, anyone who lives in the land of Israel, all his sins are forgiven. Because it says, V'chiper ad maso amo, and his land atones for his nation. Now, so the Jew can live in Israel and do whatever sins he wants, and he's forgiven for that? Obviously not. What's the proof? Because once we lived there, we sinned, and then we were punished. So it can't be. But our rabbis say it is so, because that's how the verse is understood. So what do you mean? Within limitations. Within limitations, in its proper context. Everything. This is a very big problem that people do, is they take one statement from a pasuk, from a statement of the sages, from a rabbi said something, and they make it a slogan, and they build a religion around it. And they say, look, it says that. This is the principle that can never be broken. And it's like, well, you know that's contradicted by like 10 other sources. You have to understand it in context. It doesn't mean to the extreme that you would like it to mean. It means within a context, right? All these things. A person who doesn't live in Israel is like one who had no God. So there are certain sectors of the Orthodox community that like to throw that at other sectors of the Orthodox community, right? And, oh, really? So let me see. So Moshe Feinstein didn't have a God, and Rav Victor Miller didn't have a God, and Rav Arkala didn't have a God, and Rashi didn't have a God, and the Alababsha Rebbe didn't have a God, and the Samar Rebbe didn't have a God. What are you saying? You take every tzaddik who ever lived not in Israel, and you turn them into a Rasha? What are you, out of your mind? They didn't learn Torah either. They didn't know that it said that. It's within a context. People can build whole religions around single statements. It's a very big problem of fundamentalism and extremism within certain sectors of the Orthodox community. And we've got to calm down, people. We've got to calm down.
Karna says you can't trust a rabbi who says that you can live in Israel.
Who says that? They're right. Okay, I don't even want to get started with the Torah chapter, please. Don't get me started. So yeah, you have rule number 1. My Rebbe says, be normal. That was my Rebbe. And I met my Rebbe. He said 2 things to me. One of them was when I first met my Rebbe, this is a really incredible story. I walked into the shul. I was not a shul goer. Okay, something about me. This goes back, I don't know, 20 something years. Not much of a shul goer was I. But I happened to be with a friend. We walked into the shul. I had heard that there was a new rabbi, whatever. His name was Rav Moshe Pluchak. Anyway, I introduced myself to him, and he looked at me, and he said, a future Merwis. That's what he said to me, a future Merwis. What does it mean, a future Merwis? There's a man who davened in his shul named Alan Merwis. His daughter is now my wife. Okay. So he just met me. Anyway, but he's a person who he's not a guru, but he understands people very well, and he can sum people up pretty fast. Anyway, he met me, he immediately knew me. Anyway, that's a very big privilege for me to have a Rabbi like that. But then he also saw that I was holding a certain literature of a certain sect within Judaism, I'm not going to name. And when he saw me holding this literature, he looked at me and he said, rule number 1 in Judaism, be normal. Okay? So if you walk away from my class with nothing else, rule number 1 in Judaism, be normal. So that means when I say that a person who says Ashrei 3 times a day is guaranteed a place in the world to come, because it says so in the Gemara, be normal. Let your understanding of that statement be put into a balanced context.
Rabbi David said, don't judge Judaism by the Jews.
Okay, that's another great one. It's true. It's true. So now there's one, the Ashrei is made up of a set of psukim that each one starts with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And there's a praise for God for each letter. There's a pasuk that starts with Aleph and it starts with Beis, and there's one letter missing. What letter is missing? Nun is missing. Yes, Nun is missing. Why is Nun missing? The Gemara says because Nun is the beginning of a pasuk that says Nafala lo tosif kum besulas Yisrael. She has fallen; she shall not rise again. The Basulas Yisrael, the Virgin of Israel, meaning the Jewish nation, has fallen, she shall not rise again. So in order not to hint at that verse, King David left out any verse starting with the letter Nun. But, says the Gemara, even though it was left out, King David, who wrote this, it's called Tehillah LeDavid, a praise of David. I believe it's the only one. Is it the only one in Tehillim that's called a Tehillah LeDavid, as opposed to Tefillah or something else? Mizmor, Tehillah LeDavid. He nevertheless says, David HaMelech supported those who were fallen. He didn't even hint to those who were fallen, but he supported them. So the next verse, the Samech, is Somech Hashem Lechol HaNofilim. God supports all those who have fallen. And here in the Tefillah we have Somech Noflim. We have a reference to that God is supporting the fallen. What is the fallen that God is supporting? That Israel has fallen and she won't get up. And what is that a reference to? The destruction. So because we didn't want to reference the destruction of Israel, we supported the fallen. So I think over here, Somech Noflim is a reference to the destruction. Rofei Cholim, I have to go quick because we're out of time. Rofei Cholim is a reference to the exile. Why? Because Hashem says, all the sickness that I put upon Mitzrayim, all the machala, the sickness that I put upon Mitzrayim, I shall not put upon you. Ki ani Hashem rofe'echa, because I am Hashem, your healer. So Mitzrayim, which was the exile, we were in Mitzrayim, that was the sickness, but God says, I am the healer. So Rofei Cholim is, Somech Noflim, you were destroyed, you went into exile, but I support you. You're in exile where the sickness is, I will heal you. Rofei Cholim. Matir Asurim, I shall release those who are bound. I think it's obvious that it's a reference in this context that I'm building. That would be a reference to the redemption, when we are released from the bounds of exile and freed to Israel. And the final stage in redemption is Umekayim Emunasal L'Shenei Afar. And following the redemption, the ultimate stage is the resurrection of the righteous. So here we'll pause. Okay, so that's just what did I do over there? I just gave you sort of a national Jewish context to put that in, aside from the obvious personal context of God is supporting the fallen, and we could all relate to what that is in our own lives and the lives of the people around us, and this healing the sick and freeing those who are bound. But that last phrase of picking people up out of the dirt, it can be understood metaphorically to be referring to people who are just really, really downtrodden. They're in the dirt, and God picks them up. Yes, it can, but also literally, because we're talking about resurrection the whole way through, it could be the literal resurrection. Well, if that's talking about the literal resurrection, which is a stage of the redemption, then what were the first three talking about? So that's what I want to say. The destruction and the going out into exile, the God sustaining us in exile, God returning us from the exile, and God resurrecting the righteous at the end.